Hi, Celeste.
Hi, Yuri. ¿Cómo estás?
Wow, it's good to see a bunch of familiar faces.
Dr. Montoya. I wasn't going to miss this. How are you?
Doing good, thank you.
International, well-known, of course.
No.
Dr. Montoya.
Yeah, notorious for being quirky and useless. I would wear that as a badge of honor.
So I'm gonna be muting all once we get started at 2, and I'm just gonna make some comments that we're gonna be waiting until get started at 2:05. So it's just so everybody knows, and that actually this also is going to be recorded as well.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Greg here. I'm keeping my video off because I just came in from working in the garden and you do not want to see me.
I do want to see you, Greg.
Another day. I look forward to hearing what Manuel has to say.
Dr. Montoya, what's the R stands for?
Rodolfo.
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 Yeah. First name is Manuel Julian.
Manuel Julian.
And then Rodolfo.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
$158.
Manuel, I'm particularly interested in your presentation because while we were in Marseille, we got very involved in looking at how Marseille in France has invested in the creative economy to reuse their old industrial space in all sorts of clever ways for arts and cultural and incubator space. Really fascinating. How much they've invested in it and how much activity has resulted from it. So
okay. Well,
put Marseille on your list of places to visit if you want to see a massive investment. We got to know the cultural affairs director there for the city of Marseille, and he got great pleasure in pointing out that the city of Marseille, which is about 2 million people, invests almost as much in cultural and creative economy kind of activities as the entire U.S. National Endowment for the Arts.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. I hope to touch on aspects of creative economy on this. I'll try my best to incorporate that.
I'm sure you will,
yeah.
Since it's a topic close to your heart.
Well, hello, everybody. It's 2 p.m. Good afternoon from our beautiful Albuquerque, New Mexico. Weather is fantastic out there, and I hope everybody is healthy and safe, and all your families as well. We're really honored to have Dr. Manuel Julian Rodolfo Montoya with us, and we are going to wait a little bit, 2:05. We've had a lot of interest in having, this conversation or hearing the conversation with Dr. Manuel Montoya. So we're gonna wait until 2:05 to get started. And as a reminder, and we have actually our former executive director of Global Ties, Adele. Welcome, Adele.
Oh.
I know you're muted, but you can unmute too. We're really excited.
Oh, hi.
Hi, Adele.
Yeah, I thought I would change up my evening routine today and join you guys. And the conversation also sounded super interesting, and I wanted to see some familiar faces.
Well, thank you. Makes us really happy. And once it's 2:01, so we're just gonna wait 4 more minutes to get officially started. And as a reminder, we are recording this conversation as it's needed for us so other people can have access later on, and it's going to be posted on our website, globaltiesabq.org. So we're just going to wait 3 more minutes. And once again, thank you, Dr. Montoya, for this amazing opportunity that you're giving us today to have a conversation with you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So 2:05, we can get started. We're just waiting for more people to join us.
Okay. And now that you gave me host duties, I'll start just passively admitting people.
Okay.
Okay.
So is it back to you, Destiny?
So Dr. Montoya is actually the host now.
He's, yeah, he was gonna give access to, let me see.
Yes.
I'm gonna test the share screen. That's okay. Yeah. Okay. There we go.
Perfect.
Excellent. Do you have him now, Destiny?
Have what?
The access to admitting people.
No, so it's something we're gonna have to deal with later on, but basically there can only be one host the way we have our settings. And so since Dr. Montoya needs to share his screen, we have to have him as the host. And so yeah, we're gonna have to mess with that.
Okay.
Quite all right. I can do it though, no problem.
Yeah, I was in a call a couple of weeks ago like this, a large call, and someone kept accidentally sharing their screen and it can get kind of messy. So we'll keep the settings the way they are, but figure it out. We're all adapting to Zoom and its needs. But just so everyone is aware, I will be actively sharing, when we ask the questions, I'll be typing them into the chat box. So we have those written down as well. And please feel free to leave comments and whatnot in that as we go along.
All right, and let me see. And it is officially 2:05. Are you okay, Doctor, to get started?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Again, good afternoon and beautiful Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I'm making the comment where we are because I'm excited that we have a lot of people around the world. I know that a lot of people from Mexico was going to be joining us. And of course, we have our former ED, and she's in Amsterdam. So who knows how many people we have, which is really, really excited for me. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Yuridia Morales, and I am the Executive Director of Global Ties Albuquerque. And it's truly an honor for me to have this conversation series with Dr. Manuel Julian Rodolfo Montoya. I like to say the full name because that's your name, Dr. Montoya.
Please do.
And we are really excited, and I'm very honored to have you with us, with all this amazing audience that we have today here. And virtually, we decided to do this staying globally engaged so we can have the opportunity to keep talking to our members, to our community, and these hard times. So once again, Dr. Montoya, and something that I love about you're a native New Mexican. You were born and raised in here in Mora, New Mexico. And I was reading your bio, and something that really caught my attention before, of course, your magnificent and remarkable job that you do with the university and other actually institutions. That it says still you research global political economy, and you are concerned with how we make the planet a meaningful part of our social and economic realities. That is truly amazing that somebody like you, that you love what you do, but you can put your passion with the studies that you're doing. So I would love to hear from you. Once again, we're really honored to have you today with us. And if you can please tell us a little bit about you and the remarkable job that you do with the university and other institutions will be great.
Yeah, so thank you, Yuri. I'm honored to be here, and it's really touching to see so many people that have been allies and colleagues. And for those of you that I've never met before, it's a pleasure to digitally meet you. Yeah, it's kind of weird to have this discussion and to talk about making the planet a meaningful space when we're going through what is quite possibly the most meaningful universal shared experience that we've had in recorded modern history, at least. And to think about all of the different ways in which we have to make sense of the world has really taken me back to a bunch of old ways of thinking that were part of my early educational career. What I want to do today is to introduce something that has been a conversation with Global Ties, with the Global Education Office, and several others of you might have heard me talk about this. But I've started to change my teaching structure at UNM, and it actually happened just before the transition to digital and online. But one of the things that I was very interested in doing was changing the way that students saw and played around with different lenses of seeing the world. And I found that even in a 3-hour class, students, we would get into a really interesting discussion. And what we basically would do was we would checklist all of the things that are going on today. Like if we're talking about nuclear proliferation, we just check off the list all of the places where that's an urgent issue, hotspots. And so it really is about trends, and we never really go deeply into thinking about why those phenomena actually shape the world and make it planetary in the first place. And I'm a real stickler about that. I think that more often than not, when we talk about globalization, we're actually using a very superficial way of doing that, because really our discussion is a very complicated one. We're all trying to share meaning. And as a result of that, I think it's related to the presentation I'm going to do today. We kind of flatten the discussion on globalization. More often than not, what we really mean by that is internationalization. And we kind of use nations as units of talking about the way that the world works. Well, we know through COVID-19 and really the massive experience that is being felt worldwide, I think that there's now room and opportunity to think about what's deconstructed and what makes the planet its own important thing on its own. But to get to that, you really have to, there's a lot of ingredients that go into that soup. And so what I introduced was to my students was a system called Terra Prime. And what that is, it might sound like a joke at first, but I was very interested in how people who play games like Magic the Gathering and other kind of card fantasy-based games construct realities to think about complex world making. And I thought that'd be an interesting way to teach globalization, is you actually get a bunch of cards that look like tarot cards, and then you introduce them as lenses to analyze any number of phenomena. So we could take a bunch of issues like climate change, ocean systems degradation, nuclear proliferation, pandemic, and you can start looking at the different layers in which we actually have a deep discussion about this and make sense of those issues. And you really need a lot of help to do that, because if you're just sitting there talking, let's talk about climate change, you really are only going to get to really the tip of the iceberg on what's talked about in the media and how we talk about it in some deeper circles. But in a lot of ways, there's not a whole lot of opportunity to go further with depth like that. So what I decided was, let's take the last half hour of a very interesting class and make it the first half hour. And so what I want to do today is I want to talk about populism. And instead of trying to survey all of the different political manifestations of populism, I actually want to begin with this card right here. It's a card I introduced to my students. We call it the Legion card, Crowds and Power. And basically, it's like a tarot card in the sense that you kind of have an image that inspires you to think about a certain way that the world works. And then it asks a couple of important questions that frame that discussion. And today I'm going to actually use the Legion card to talk about populism and the logic of populism. To do that, though, let's get to a couple of key ways of understanding what populism is. So to set the stage, most of us are aware of the manifestation of populism and its growth throughout the world. And this is not determined by any one ideology. Populism has grown in a very conservative way, in a very liberalized way. There's all sorts of different forms of populism. We see it in the Trump administration. We see it in AMLO in Mexico. We see it in the Yellow Vests, in Bolsonaro. Most every part of the world has had some sort of populist movement, meaning that there has been some sort of political approach that has dominated that, and I'm going to use the direct definition of populism from the Oxford English Dictionary, a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. Now, it's a very formal way of thinking about populism. And in a lot of ways, you'll see that play itself out in lots of various ways throughout the world. So one of my questions, I guess, has to be, if this is a planetary phenomenon, if it's not just happening in one part of the world, how does populism begin to manifest as a discourse that means something enough to us that it changes our political and economic choices? And for us to understand that a little bit, I actually want us to think a little bit about a couple of key concepts, just to get ourselves thinking about populism and what it is. I'm a big fan of certain philosophers of the 20th century, and probably my favorite person is Gilles Deleuze. And Deleuze, he had a really interesting way of thinking about popular culture and thinking about the way that we experience the world. I think it was a very unique perspective. But I first learned about populism through actually a study of Alice in Wonderland, through Gilles Deleuze. And you'll notice there's an image over here on the side here of Alice in Wonderland. And one of the observations that Deleuze made when he read Alice in Wonderland was that there's a lot of emphasis on depth and surface. So what you mean by that is when you go down the rabbit hole, you basically have some sort of barrier or boundary, and then the rabbit hole becomes a representation of going deep into something entirely nonsensical. As Alice goes down the rabbit hole, she's actually trying to make sense of her world in a very, very chaotic way. And in fact, I've often said that my favorite quote and the thing that got me thinking about globalization was, as she's falling down the rabbit hole, this is the very, like maybe the fourth paragraph of the entire book. She says, "I wonder what my latitude and longitude are, if those things actually meant anything to me, or if I knew what those terms meant." And I think what happens when we experience globalization is that we experience a falling into a rabbit hole, a depth that we're unfamiliar with. And as a result of that, everything has to be renegotiated and re-understood and reinterpreted as having some sort of meaning or depth. Deleuze would say that in order for us to actually have shared meaning, and in order for us to actually have some sort of common vocabulary, by definition, those things have to be flattened. In other words, for you and me and everybody else in this Zoom chat room to agree to the meaning of a thing, we basically have to negotiate and compromise the meaning of these issues. And so as a result of that, I think that there is a relationship between the way that when we become collective in our thinking, we actually by necessity have to flatten out that shared meaning. So his big argument is that surface becomes depth. And how he does that in Alice in Wonderland, if you ever read the book or watch any of the films that represent it, you'll notice that there are a lot of flat people. So the cards are always flat. You know, there's lots of royalty. So there's kings and queens, and they're beheading people, which in a lot of ways Deleuze interprets as a cutting off of elitism and a cutting off of the mind and the head. So in a lot of ways, the brain is being cut off of this. It's kind of this mindless, chaotic sort of stuff. It's a mad tea party. There's all sorts of things that are going on, but in a lot of ways, they're kind of negotiating tall things and flat things. And that happens to Alice as well. She becomes big and she becomes small. And I'm actually obsessed with this in literature and in art and culture, because that's also the way that we experience The Wizard of Oz. And in fact, many people who have studied The Wizard of Oz as a piece of literature have made the argument that that is actually a book about populism, particularly The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, because you have a wizard who is actually behind a screen, who is actually dominating the narrative. And then when you actually see behind the curtain, you actually see somebody who is not who they say they are. They're not this big, powerful creature. They're a huckster. And so in a lot of ways, his appeal is a populist appeal. He wants people to believe in his greatness, but at the same time, there is this process whereby he's concealing the commonness and the kind of the false populism is revealed through that process. And so again, I just want you guys to think about that as a framing position when we think about what populism is and why it manifests in society. And one of the big questions that I wanted to just raise as a food for thought, because you're probably going to get better news outlets to talk about populism. And I can even share a couple on the chat bar if you ever want to check out like interactive maps on where populism is emanating and what are the main issues involved. But you'll normally consistently see people feeling disenfranchised from some form of elitism. But the effect of that is actually quite powerful. And one of the things that I've noticed is that the common element is the disparagement of expertise, in that experts are kicked out of the room because their process of making meaning of the world doesn't seem or appear as urgent as others. In other words, there's a certain way in which people are longing to feel like and urgent to feel a shared meaning. We all want to understand a problem in the same way. And as a result of that, experts, you know, they're kind of like the slow professor at the university. It's like, oh, you know, that professor is going off on tangents, and I can give you the greatest hits of every criticism that a professor gets when they're teaching a class and why they're working through an issue. But in a lot of ways, I think populism in this era has been characterized particularly as a disparagement of expertise, which is why I'm gonna admit a couple of people here. Apologies. So this is why I brought up this question of Legion. I actually chose to name the card Legion because it represents a certain kind of mythology around the many parts being this massive, unthinking whole that manifests all over. In fact, I used an image of the Jesus healing the man from Gadara, which is a medieval representation of a biblical myth of a person who has been possessed, a schizophrenic, a representation of schizophrenia in medieval times and also Christian mythology. And so this idea of, you know, somebody having many voices inside of them being a problem and being really, really scary. I'm thinking about this in terms of what happens when we have a populist appeal and where does it come from? And part of that actually comes from popular culture itself. I want to just kind of add as an ingredient here a recent debate that has gone on between Martin Scorsese and James Gunn. And a lot of people have taken sides in this, but Martin Scorsese, before this last year's Oscars, made an argument that the Marvel movies weren't really good movies. They weren't legitimate cinema as he understands it, because he felt that Marvel films were theme parks. And James Gunn, who is one of the directors of the films within the Marvel franchise, he got into it with him, and he told him that was just some sort of snobbery that Martin Scorsese kind of sits on high and talks about high art and high film, and he doesn't really have an appreciation for what happens when everyday people, is actually James Gunn's reaction, is everyday people need to experience art too. And so it turned into this discussion that was kind of going awry. And the debate actually turned into a big deal in art circles, because a lot of people started to take sides and ask, well, why is it that Marvel films aren't popular art, or legitimate art? And some people would say, well, you know, people who do digital renderings and computer graphics and stuff like that, there's a lot of skill and talent in that. Well, at the same time, Scorsese's talking at a level of, you know, I've learned from these kind of master filmmakers, and this is kind of the lineage of the kind of work that I'm doing. And as a result of that, there's this kind of weird passing of two ships, and they're not really having a shared conversation about each other. One gets accused of being elitist and out of touch with the people. Another one uses the people as a vehicle for gaining a little bit of political power, and then really punishing and pointing and judging the expert for not understanding the people. And this becomes really par excellence a perfect example of what you see in modern politics. You'll notice that in the early 2016 election, Trump actually referred to his voters as forgotten citizens. And he associated that with coal miners, and he associated certain groups of people as having been forgotten. The same thing you can see in Mexico during the AMLO presidency, is, you know, groups of people who had been disenfranchised by people who were out of touch with the people, right? And it's really interesting to see how those things then they really do pass in the night. And populism actually becomes problematic when those discussions don't actually go back and critically engage each other anymore. They actually separate quite visibly, and people choose sides, and then it becomes a very passionate discussion. I don't want to throw out a bunch of background or stuff, but I do want to talk a little bit about some of the keywords that matter in this discussion. And for that, I have a real affinity for the thinking of Raymond Williams. He wrote a book called Keywords, and you'll notice that in this, it's actually a digest of really important terms that he feels intersect with each other in this problem between the rich and the poor, the elites, and what he would call the common folk. So actually, I can always make these available to Yudi and Destiny if you guys want to have just like some references to what they are. But I just want to survey some of the words that he goes through this. We're not going to read it or anything, but culture was a main word that he starts using to frame this, but then he uses the words democracy, and then he goes into folk. He uses the word formalist, and then he very quickly goes into the word mass and masses. And he starts to describe why the masses emanate from crowds. And this is actually what I wanted to kind of engage in a conversation and a Q&A with you guys about, is that this is actually one of the scary or really urgent parts of why populism is problematic. Because when we start using these terms, popular, folk, mass, crowds, and all of those things start to kind of congeal into a shared meaning, you actually get other words that become a little bit more problematic. For example, mob. And you have to ask yourself, if populist appeal is a thing, and if this logic actually works itself out, people who feel disenfranchised and aggrieved necessarily find their power within the nameless crowd. And there's a lot of really interesting thoughts on the relationship between crowds and power. For example, there's a book by Elias Canetti that talks, it's called Crowds and Power. But this whole idea that the mob then becomes this non-hierarchical process whereby people don't hold themselves accountable. And I actually want you guys to do this as an exercise. I would like, if you guys have access to chat, I would like you guys to write down what you think is the power of a crowd or a mob. And you can do that while I'm talking, but I'd love to just see on the screen what you think is their power. I'll volunteer one, right? I think that when you're in a crowd, you feel less accountable because you're anonymous. And so as a result of that, you can, I would do something that I normally wouldn't do as if I were held individually accountable, right? And so that anonymity becomes part of where my power emanates from a crowd. What else, what do you guys think is the power of a crowd or a mob? Power of many, group power? Yeah, so there is this kind of idea of things that are more than the sum of their parts. So the power of the many becomes some sort of collective representation, and that becomes that becomes a really, really important part of what we call populism. Fear, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really good one. The idea that there's an awe and wonder to crowds. Think about 1 million people marching in one place, right? Once that's done, a lot of people were talking about the Arab Spring, and one of the things I remember from that moment was one of the Twitter feeds was, we have feared them for so long, now they shall fear us, right? So there was this kind of collective element of the power, less fear of alienation because there's solidarity. That's great. Yeah. So you guys are starting to see where that actually has a lot of power, relief from normal societal constraints. That's why a lot of people, for example, like Mardi Gras, like Carnival. And you'll actually see in COVID-19, I've actually been thinking about the Legion card a lot in terms of the protesters and the people who are going to the beaches, you know, and who are thinking about this. If there is these elements of fear and wanting to collectively belong to something so that their voice is heard, particularly in a state of helplessness, this is a very problematic thing. And regardless of what side of politics you stand on, you can see that this kind of process is a problematic thing. People feel more powerful, like they can blend in, included and validated, absolutely. Power of a crowd is a sense of validation and assurance from everybody else. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. No one is individually accountable, especially if the mob creates problems, right? That's exactly right. So you'll notice, so then my question then becomes, what are ways in which we start to express that and believe in the power of a mob, which separates us then from our accountability, both individually and to institutions like the state. When the state asks us, you know, we have to stay at home. There are some people who are going to buy into that and some people who aren't. And you'll normally notice that the vehicle for that is a populist logic. I hope that makes sense, because then it moves me into then a final way of thinking about this, and that's the difference between themes and theme parks. So every idea and every political choice, every economic choice that we make has a certain depth of meaning to it, right? But then all of a sudden, through populism, and if we're going to accept that popular culture is a part of that, the way that we actually address and solve problems then becomes very, very difficult, because then we choose anointed people. And that's one thing that I've noticed is a trademark of modern populism, is that it connects very much to celebrity. And if you'll notice in the Trump administration, even by his own admission to his staff, that he treats every decision that he makes has to be made with using his celebrity as the primary method for his decision making. So if his celebrity is compromised, then it's not a good choice. It's not actually made on any other spectrum, but the level of ability he has through this kind of celebrity that he's generated, right? And that's why he learned that through his reality television life. But there's a lot of other examples of that. You know, in the class that I taught this last semester, one of the really interesting ones that I heard a student say was, you know, a lot of people who are experts in helicopter safety cared about helicopter safety. And they tried to get people to think about it. But the only time that governors and policymakers paid attention was when Kobe Bryant was killed in a helicopter crash. And really this was kind of the framing of using this lens of analysis. Like, how are social problems addressed by using or thinking about celebrity as kind of the vehicle of the populist figurehead? Prison reform. There's a lot of experts in prison reform, but Kim Kardashian becomes one of the figureheads and one of the champions for it. So, that becomes a manifestation. And this answers the question that Destiny is positioning here. Why is it manifesting today, and what does that tell us about our political climate? Is that in a lot of ways, we have a very complex geopolitics. We have a lot of sense. We're falling down the rabbit hole just like Alice. And in a lot of ways, the desperation that we attempt to feel by relying on celebrity is using them as the vehicle or the mouth of the populist appeal. It's actually the popular person that gets to speak about complex and important issues. It's not the experts. And you're going to notice that also in the discussion of COVID-19 is that Dr. Fauci, in a weird way, is kind of in a stacked and almost schizophrenic way. He has actually become both a celebrity unto himself, and he has become kind of the expert who has to be in the back of the room. And it's only actually when we propel him or elevate him to the status of celebrity that his voice actually gets to participate in this complex set of choices that the public is trying to make. Again, a process of populism. So this isn't just a de facto thing. It's not just that some people magically gathered into a room and said, we're not going to take it anymore. We're actually going to organize against these elites who don't care about us. It's actually far more passive than that. That populism all across the world has to do with a bunch of different forces that nobody has a shared meaning around. That we live in a world where it's actually very, very much people are desperate for meaning, and they're going to latch on to people who say that they have an answer. And more often than not, experts hesitate to do that. Experts are very careful in the way that they compose that. And so in a weird way, experts are disparaged as a result of this desire for meaning that they're not necessarily comfortable kind of forcing onto the public consciousness. I think that's correct. Governor Cuomo actually has very much the same qualities and characteristics, especially when he kind of put out that image of the hand sanitizer, like that brick of hand sanitizer that he wanted to kind of get out there. He was very much trying to show that the way that you can solve this problem is with Purell. And you're going to see people just desperate to have those images in their head to latch onto, and anybody who's trying to kind of add texture to that, it becomes problematic, and people they politicize that very quickly.
So yeah, really quick, two comments. The first one, just everybody knows is going to be a test. We're going to be sending it to you, so everything that he's saying. And the second one, I'm not kidding, I want to be sending you a test. And the second one is that at the end of your amazing conversation, that the audience is going to be able to send you some questions. So I just wanted to point it out there, but thank you so much. And I do apologize for interrupting.
It wasn't an interruption. And in fact, I'm done. Like at that point, what I basically want you guys to do is just kind of see this card and ask, if populism is a relationship between crowds and power, and if popular culture is in there, how can we reshape this discussion about what populism is doing to society? Because that's really at the meat of it. People are going to make choices all over the world, but the logic is going to be the same. So I actually welcome conversations or comments about this. And that third question is, what's the connection between populism and pop culture? Just like Martin Scorsese, as goes this discussion about themes and theme parks in the Marvel movies, so too are questions about coal and coal miners, and about disenfranchised workers in different parts of the world, and other forms of popular revolt. So let me look at some of these questions. How could you leverage this populism force for a positive or an organized way? With a star like JFK that was a celebrity and a politician at the same time, could you make a new political figure that champions a cause like climate change? And you have, right? Greta Thunberg has actually become a celebrity in that regard. And in fact, she's very uncomfortable with that. And you'll actually hear her talking a lot about how she wants to go away. And she's a little girl, first of all, and that's problematic in itself, is that she's now being elevated to that kind of the status of a celebrity and a fountain or figurehead for these issues. I think that's a kind of an essential question. I'm going to pose it back to you guys because I really don't want to arrogate the answer. I think that all populism emanates, I think, from there's an element of good intent in each of those things, but it's actually the process that's problematic. It's that no matter how good the intent is, we have to know that at a certain point that stuff is being flattened. And so the original intent itself, the sophistication of solving a problem, actually has a very different process than making people feel invested in that problem. I'm going to try to get to these. Should I focus on the ones that are being asked on chat? Anybody wants to ask can also just ask if they want to.
Something that I would like to ask you, Doctor, if that's okay with you. So when you and I started talking about, just send me this PDF, what actually you're showing one of them. And so we were discussing and what kind of topic we wanted to discuss with this, the audience and what we have right now going on with all of this uncertainty. I'm curious, why did you decide and to talk specifically about populism?
I really like the topic because it can be applied to almost every issue. I mean, several of you have been bringing questions up that are related to it. For example, the answer to climate change has to happen in two different ways. One of them is that we have to generate a lot of technical expertise about how to address climate change. People who are climate change deniers, they're operating at a different, they're addressing a different dimension of that, and that is they're trying to understand and maybe even subvert the political will necessary to make choices. So all the expertise in the world could present solutions, but do people have the political will to actually make those choices? And I see this with my previous work with child soldiers. So in a lot of ways, there are laws in place that actually protect children. There are covenants that are internationally derived to prevent child labor, for example. The question then becomes, do we have the political will to actually make sure that those labor practices are actually enacted in a standardized way? And the answer is no, we haven't yet. So in a lot of ways, the question is, how can I make this popular enough to address that problem? And what is lost in translation when I flatten that discussion? The one that I think about most is blood diamonds, because most people, when they think about like exploited minerals, can easily kind of use that as an example. But again, we have certification schemes that can address conflict resources like blood diamonds. There is a process called the Kimberley scheme, which is intended to try to at least create a certification or a process of certification for identifying when a diamond is mined responsibly, quote unquote. But again, do people have the political will to actually exercise that scheme? And that's actually more about populism than it is about the technical expertise.
We have very great questions going on in here. If I can tell you one, just really quick, is there any difference between populism in capitalist economies against communist or socialist economies?
I guess in the sense that it's about certain choices or ideologies about how you value things. So in a capitalist economy, you're going to say that everything is open to valuation in that way, and that markets, ideally, that markets would be liberalized in that way. But generally, the logic of populism wouldn't change. It's just that, again, that's actually one of the big problems, is that when we get into addressing like why capitalism and communism are different, we don't actually understand that the process is the same. A good example of that is we even teach this in a class. I know Randy Trask is on this call, so he's taught this in one of the international management classes as well. But there's an issue that happened maybe 15 years ago between the Chinese government and the United States. It was called the Scenic Unical case, and I can put that on the chat. You guys can do a quick search on that, and you'll see the differences. You had a company, Chinese National Offshore Oil Company, that wanted to buy Unical, which is a California-based oil company. And the big controversy was that you had this big socialist economy that wanted to buy an oil company from the United States, and that turned into a really politicized issue. And it was this kind of socialism versus capitalism sort of thing. We don't want communists buying our oil and then changing the way that the market works. There's all sorts of complications. What was ironic about it is that as that discussion started to make itself public, there was you could call it hypocrisy, but it basically was the contradiction of populism. Is that viewed from that position, the Chinese government was actually 51% shareholder of Scenic. And as a result of that, they said, well, this is a puppet company. It's actually using, the communists are actually trying to use capitalism to their own goals. And in the end, it turned out that the United States used every government power that it had to obstruct that multinational company from buying Unical. It in fact never bought it. So in a weird way, the United States acted like a socialist command economy in order to prevent that sale. And the Chinese were actually trying to use a capitalistic, liberalistic argument that they have the right on the free market to purchase all that stuff. And in both of those cases, communism and socialism had nothing to do with it. It was populism. It was actually the populist discourse that flattened out, that said, this is East versus West. This is kind of this very dull, like not very sharp discussion that's going on. So the answer is there isn't a difference when you think about it logically.
So there is another question, Doctor. And let me go back really quick because I know it's almost at the beginning. Give me 1 second. Is there a functional difference between a physical and an online MOB?
An online mob?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, right? Because we live in the world of trolls, and again, I would make the argument that the logic is the same. Is that being able to anonymously, we now live in a digitized avatar-based culture as much as anything else. And so I can hide my identity in basically a public space, and I can say whatever I want. And it's interesting that when I become a digital form of the mob, I say some pretty mean things. And we've seen examples of, trolling that has actually led to depression and suicide amongst people who put themselves out there in the public. There's a process, right? On one hand, this kind of digital commons is the way for us to create shared meaning in a very accelerated way. And I think some people have said that Victor Camino is talking about long-term orientation. Like really, in a lot of ways, this has kind of made our ability to have shared meaning in almost instantaneous. The way that we agree to something actually becomes very quickly accelerated to a shared form of meaning. I would make the argument that this is why we have a lot of popular ways of describing certain forms of behavior that would have taken really kind of generational ways of doing that. Like I was talking with a student the other day about humble brags, and like how quickly that kind of characteristic or that feature or woke culture, right? These are all terminologies that people actually get used to very quickly because the information is disseminated very quickly. So it flattens out quicker, but it actually does subscribe to the same logic.
This conversation is like, I really feel like I want to go back to study. And having you, Doctor, as one of my professors, because you're already my mentor, and I'm really, always honored to say that.
I didn't pay you for this marketing, but
yeah, I'm happy to do that. No, it's totally fine. So if it's 2:46, if that's okay, we can ask one more question. Doctor?
Yeah, sure.
It's why does populism always end up in disaster, dictatorship, or anarchy?
The answer is it probably doesn't. It's another aspect of what we draw our attention to, right? Crisis grabs our attention. Like a thing wouldn't be urgent if it wasn't urgent. So in a lot of ways, populism manifests as crisis in the politics of attention that we pay to things. I would also, I mean, because I'm very, I don't like to be morally focused on too many of the negative aspects. I mean, I actually, on the Scorsese debate, I actually side quite a bit with James Gunn, and I actually say, like, there's, I'm a big fan of comic books, and I actually love that Stan Lee, before he died, one of the last speeches that he made, he said that he wanted his characters and his heroes, he actually wanted a new generation to recreate what he had done, because he felt like he did the best he can do to make everyday people feel like they belong to the world, and that they had heroes. And I think that, you know, that's problematic in a logical way, but I mean, it's beautiful in another, in the sense that now, for example, Wolverine, which is a character in the X-Men, is now a young girl, and she, like, her story is very much different from the character that was created in the 1960s. And so there are all these vehicles wherein we're creating new forms of shared meaning, and we actually are critiquing forms of power, and we are actually challenging the false kings and queens of the world, to actually show us whether or not there's depth in their thinking. So populism isn't problematic in and of itself. It's a powerful force. And you know, I'm always, almost to a flaw, I quote Dr. King's, one of his most lesser known speeches. He actually made this speech in South Atlanta, in the Cabbagetown district. During the last month of his life, he spent a lot of his time talking about anti-intellectualism. And he said quite forcefully in one of his media interviews that anti-intellectualism is the greatest threat to civil society. And when you think about populism, we can see it as necessary. We actually see it as important. You know, dictatorships have been overthrown because of populist appeal. People have started to care about climate change as a result of populism. People feel like they belong to the world in different ways because of pop culture. That's really, really important. The other side of it is that we cannot believe that the surface is exclusively the depth. The moment that we do that and the moment that we start to disparage and kick the experts out, is the moment that we threaten the very fabric of civil society. I believe that very strongly. Yeah, Hitler was a populist, so was Castro, Chavez. When populists control government, it doesn't end up well. And part of that, to L.W. Blank, part of that is because governance is about expertise. It's technical. I know that Lucho is actually on the call as well, and he and I talk a lot about regionalism and Brexit, and why Brexit was more of a populist response to very difficult technical processes. And so when you kick out the people who are good technicians, that's it. Like, you actually can't have institutions run the way that they do. So you can't have one or the other. You have to appreciate the dialectic relationship between the two.
That is all correct. And Dr. Montoya, before we wrap up this wonderful conversation, I would like for you to talk to the audience and the research on what you do, because I know you have a remarkable career and you're so passionate about, you know, this topic in particular right now for this audience. And we started talking about, you know, how, you know, the fabulous everything populism and what it is right now around the world. But I would love, if that's okay with you, what do you do at Anderson School of Management and the research that you have been doing? Because I know that you have, you know, you are out there helping a lot of institutions, not just UNM, and I know the UNM is extremely lucky to have you there.
Thank you so much. I guess if I were to boil it down to something, I've always told people that I'm intellectually promiscuous. Like, I have always believed that disciplines are really important, and in fact, I spent the majority of my life getting too much paperwork to prove that I can show up into a room, right? Because I have one background in international relations and the other is in comparative literature, and in a weird way, those I tried to connect the two and connect them by not necessarily being one or the other too much. because I have found that in a weird way, interdisciplinarity doesn't really get a whole lot of attention. It actually is kind of the side effect of people having a conversation across disciplines. And so in the end, I am actually very much like the island of misfit toys. I want to ask questions that are important to our understanding of globalization in the world that don't necessarily conform to any one discipline. And I think there are many allies to that in this room right now, in the Zoom room. And so one of the things I'm passionate about is how we actually teach that. I actually pulled up the temporary deck. I actually have a really wonderful artist in Albuquerque that's building the actual deck that we're going to use as a textbook for classes. And there's going to be two versions. One of them is going to be like a $10 deck. It's going to have Loteria style art. And then the second one is going to be this more Baroque kind of lacquered kind of deck that's going to be a little bit more expensive. But what I chose are, I'm just going to scroll through them. So we have the Moral Philosopher, Legion, Chimera, the Mysterious Stranger, Pangea, thinking about indigeneity, the alien gaze, what happens when we're watched, or we believe that we're being watched from a planetary level. You know, all of these different cards mean something to me because I spent my entire career thinking about the relationship between storytelling, myths, and geopolitics. And so we're actually now living in a moment where we have to make meaning and sense of the world. And more than ever, it's going to be more important to make sense of the world. And we can't make sense of the world until we understand how we are sense objects, how we actually use those objects to make sense of the world. And so I chose this kind of deck and series of cards to actually be part of a system of teaching that I'm now using to help us think through some of these complex problems. Yeah, I'm very passionate about making sure that as we make sense of the world, we don't superficially call ourselves interdisciplinary about it. I want us to be really crazy about it.
And, you know, I see a lot of interest in the people that is joining us today, and I would like to kindly ask you if it will be okay with you if we can have you once again to have another conversation with you. And I can have, right now, would like to open the opportunity for our audience. If you can give us some ideas and what would you like to hear from Dr. Montoya. And the first time that I sent out an email, you guys have the information of his bio. So I think it will be great if that's okay with you, Dr. Montoya. We can plan on another day so we can have this other great conversation with you.
I'd be more than happy to. Yeah.
That would be great. And it's 2:54, and I just wanted to, if I don't know if you have another comment to make, excuse me, Dr. Montoya, and I just would like to thank you so much on behalf of Global Ties, ABQ staff, or board of directors, or valued members, the community, and because we decided we wanted to keep engaging in the community with, once again, the situation that we have right now going on, and conversations with somebody like you, that's something that we would like to keep having. And so people can join and we can, virtually, we're right now in the virtual world, so it would be great to have you again. But thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk to you and about, a lot of people that were active and during the chat. If anybody else has any other comment, feel free to say it. If not, then once again, Dr. Manuel Julián Rodolfo Montoya. I just love it. I want to say your full name. If anybody else has any other comment, or you would like to have some closing remarks, Dr. Montoya?
No, I'm open to anybody just being interested. And in fact, once I'm done with the full deck, it's going to be 25 different cards. I'll be sure to share it with you, to share with the network. And if anybody wants to talk about any of these issues, I'm more than happy to just focus on any one of the lenses.
Thank you, Doctor. And I know that most of the audience might have my email address, but if not, I wanna put it in the chat. So if you guys have any questions, or you have any particular topic that you would like to discuss with us. And once again, remember, this is a bi-weekly conversation series that we started, staying globally engaged. And so we don't have only people from Albuquerque, but it's all over the world. So it's just in order for us to keep, the engagement that we have. Global Ties ABQ, we have been in existence as a volunteer organization in the past since 1984, and we've had a lot of visitors and international visitors, and we would like to keep engaging you with the programs that we're having right now going on virtually. And I just would like to thank each one of you and the audience for giving us this opportunity to be with you today. I know that we have a state editor with us, Ryan Colon, so thank you so much, and thank you for making the mention this morning in your amazing show, Cafecito con Colon. I love it. If you guys haven't had the opportunity to watch on Facebook, his Cafecito con Colon, every day at 9 in the morning, I'll highly recommend it. I know that a lot of you might not like Facebook, but I promise you, you're gonna have an amazing time just listening to our state editor, Mr. Brian Colon. And thank you to everybody. And Dr. Manuel Montoya, muchísimas gracias on behalf of everybody, and everybody stay safe, healthy, and
thank you so much.
Keep smiling.
Thank you, guys.
Everybody.
You guys, thanks for your time. You guys have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Doctor.
So, Manuel.
Bye-bye.
Bye.